So, imagine you've been wearing like a pair of highly advanced augmented reality glasses, basically your entire life.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, and from the exact moment you open your eyes in the morning, these glasses are instantly projecting text, labels, judgments onto absolutely everything you see.
Right. But constantly.
Exactly. So a person walks by and the glasses project the word threat or maybe attractive. You look at a car and they project mine or, expensive. You look at the weather and it just says miserable.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. But the catch is you've worn these augmented reality glasses for so long and the projection is so seamless that you've completely forgotten they're even on your face.
Right.
You operate under the absolute conviction that this heavily annotated projection is, well, what the raw physical world actually looks like.
Yeah, the labels basically become invisible to you as labels. You start to assume that, miserable is an inherent physical property of the rain itself. Rather than just a word, your own mind projected onto the water droplets. And mistaking that projection for the raw reality, well, that's kind of the default human condition.
And that is exactly what we're getting into today. Welcome to today's deep dive. We have a seriously fascinating stack of sources for you today.
We really do.
Yeah, a collection of phenomenological essays, some cognitive science research papers, and a highly structured, practical observation manual. And together, these documents break down the exact mechanics of how human beings construct their reality moment by moment.
Step by step.
Our mission today is not to learn, a new philosophical belief system or some esoteric mystical doctrine. It's not about that.
No, definitely not.
We are going to strip away those invisible layers of mental distortion. We're diving into how human attention acts as an active cognitive force that literally shapes what you experience every single second of the day.
Which I think raises a really important question right at the start. Like, what are we actually trying to achieve here?
Right.
This deep dive is about examining how your experience is already happening right now. We are not talking about trying to achieve some new, permanent elevated state of consciousness.
Because that's the usual trap, right?
Exactly. To really grasp the framework outlined in these sources, we have to drop some deeply ingrained assumptions. Specifically, our assumptions about what is happening inside our minds versus what's happening outside in the physical world.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the central premise spanning all our source material is quite bold. The research asserts that most of us live our entire lives filtered through interpretation, identity, and symbolic language.
We're just swimming in concepts.
Completely swimming in a sea of concepts, completely missing the raw perception that's happening underneath it all. And before we can even begin to examine how attention shapes reality, we have to recognize that what you normally call your reality is actually just your after-the-fact interpretation of it.
Yeah, the sources make this fundamental distinction that really serves as the bedrock for this entire discussion. There is raw experience and there is interpretation.
Okay, break that down for us.
Sure. Raw experience is strictly what is seen, heard, felt, or even thought in any given microsecond. It's just sensory data.
Right.
Interpretation is the meaning, the narrative, and the historical context that your mind rapidly assigns to that raw sensory data.
And the phenomenological essays actually offer a brilliant, grounded example of this timeline, using something as simple as looking at a tree.
Yeah, think about looking out your window right now and seeing a tree. The raw perception is nothing more than color, shape, light, and shadow hitting your retina.
Just visual data.
Exactly. Your optic nerve transmits that data. That is the direct, unedited experience. But a fraction of a second later, your language centers and memory networks activate.
Right, they kick in.
Yeah, and your brain categorizes the shapes and says, oh, that is an oak tree, and that tree is dying, or I need to rake those leaves.
The interpretation.
Exactly. That secondary conceptual process is the interpretation. The core issue of human suffering and confusion, according to our sources, is that we collapse those two distinct events. We don't notice the chronological gap between the light hitting the eye and the brain generating the sentence about the tree.
It's exactly like watching a foreign film with the director's commentary permanently turned on and massive subtitles blocking the screen.
Yes, perfect analogy.
Eventually, you get so used to reading the subtitles that you forget to watch the actors. You start to think the subtitles are the movie. So when you look out the window, you're essentially reading the word tree instead of actually experiencing the complex, living, visual data of the organism in front of you.
And the core operational principle of the framework we're analyzing today relies on reversing that habit.
Okay.
The closer your attention stays to the raw perception, the movie itself, without the director's commentary, the less distortion is introduced into your life. When you learn to observe the gap between the sensory data and the mental label, the distortion just naturally begins to fall away.
But, and this is a big, when people first attempt this, and they finally catch a genuine glimpse of that raw perception without the subtitles,
Oh yeah, they stumble.
they often stumble into a very specific psychological trap. The manual in our source stack actually warns that this trap just adds a brand new, highly deceptive layer of distortion.
Yeah, the texts refer to this trap as psychological inflation, or the problem of grandeur.
Grandeur.
Right. When someone suddenly notices these deeper, quieter aspects of their own perception, the mind's immediate biological habit is to try and categorize the experience.
Because it feels so different.
Exactly. Because the experience of raw perception feels so clear, peaceful, and profound, the mind immediately slaps a new label on it. It calls it special, or elevated, or spiritual.
So the ego just sneaks right back through the side door.
It totally does.
You manage to quiet the mind for 3 seconds, and immediately the brain says, wow, look how incredibly quiet my mind is.
What's fascinating here is how rapidly the mind converts a moment of pure observation into an identity. You experience a split second of direct, raw perception. Almost instantly, a narrative forms.
Like, I am so enlightened.
Yeah, I'm someone who sees reality deeply. I am mindful. I am awake. The actual clarity of the raw perception is completely paved over by a story about the clarity. The mind co-opts the absence of the ego to build a stronger ego.
So you're just reading a brand new set of augmented reality subtitles.
Yes.
Except instead of the subtitles saying that tree needs pruning, the subtitles now say, I'm a deeply spiritual person observing the majestic essence of this tree.
Exactly. You have manufactured distance from what is actually happening all over again. The crucial insight from the observation manual is that true cognitive clarity only increases when we completely abandon the need to make the experience meaningful, special, or personal. Raw perception doesn't require a gold star. It doesn't mean you've achieved a higher frequency. It's simply the basic mechanics of consciousness functioning without unnecessary friction.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. If we can manage to strip away those mystical labels, drop the need for our experiences to be special, and just observe the mechanics directly, what is the actual mechanism making certain things feel so incredibly real to us?
Right, what's driving it?
The cognitive science papers point to one specific culprit: attention. But they describe attention in a way that fundamentally challenges how we normally think about it.
Yeah, we typically conceptualize attention as a passive receiver. We think of it like a camera lens that just idly takes in whatever happens to be placed in front of it.
Like it's just recording.
Right. But the research argues the exact opposite. Attention is a highly active force. It functions as a powerful selection and amplification mechanism.
The papers outline that classic crowded room scenario, like being at a loud, chaotic restaurant.
Oh yeah, the cocktail party effect.
Yeah. There's a wall of acoustic noise, 100 different conversations happening simultaneously, glasses clinking, music playing. But the moment you focus your attention on the person sitting across from you, their voice suddenly pierces through the noise. It stands out.
Consider what is happening there mechanically. The physical sound waves hitting your eardrum haven't changed.
Right, the room didn't get quieter.
Exactly. The ambient volume of the room did not drop. But your attention actively selected a specific frequency from the available sensory field. It amplified its relevance, processed it through your auditory cortex, and allowed it to enter your working memory.
Wow.
Without that active deployment of attention, your friend's voice would remain completely indistinguishable from the background hum.
So when our attention rests intensely on something, it feels like we are literally bringing it into existence. It gains weight, importance, and vividness. The text calls this cognitive activation.
Yeah.
But the authors go out of their way to demystify this. We are not talking about, manifesting reality or altering the physical universe with our thoughts.
No, not at all. Cognitive activation is a neurological and phenomenological process, not mystical causation. It is simply a transition from the background of perception to the foreground.
Okay, that makes sense.
When you direct your attention, an object, a physical sensation, or a passing thought becomes highly defined. What you experience right now as your overarching reality is quite literally just the specific elements of the environment where your attention has stabilized.
So if you shift where your attention stabilizes, you fundamentally shift the reality you inhabit.
Precisely.
But the research takes this mechanism a massive step further. This cognitive activation isn't just happening to external objects in the room. The sources suggest this same mechanism completely alters how we view our own minds, challenging the very dividing line between what is me and what is the world.
This right here represents the most paradigm-shifting argument in our source stack. Human beings are deeply conditioned to divide reality into two distinct buckets.
Two buckets.
Yeah. First, the internal bucket, which contains our thoughts, our feelings, our physical sensations, and our memories. Second, the external bucket, which contains physical objects, the weather, other people.
Basically the boundary of the skin, things happening inside the body and things happening outside the body.
Exactly. But the phenomenological essays challenge you to examine this from a purely direct first-person perspective. Think about a random memory suddenly popping into your head.
Okay.
Now think about the sound of a car alarm going off down the street. From the perspective of pure observation, both of those events are simply known in the exact same field of awareness. They both arise, linger for a moment, and vanish.
They're both just spontaneous appearances on the screen of consciousness.
Right. The distinction that one appearance is inherently internal and belongs to you, while the other is external and separate from you, is purely conceptual. It's a learned geographical label. Experientially, the boundary between inside and outside is constructed by the brain's spatial processing. It is not inherent to the raw perception itself.
Okay, I have to push back on this because it sounds incredibly counterintuitive.
Sure, let's hear it.
I understand how a sudden sound, like a car alarm or a dog barking, might be a raw event that just appears in my awareness. But what about when I sit down to deliberately plan my weekly schedule, or I have a nagging feeling of anxiety about a presentation that lasts for 3 days?
Right.
That isn't just a fleeting appearance. That requires a persistent me who is doing the thinking and carrying the anxiety.
Wait, so if my internal thoughts are just appearances happening in my awareness exactly like a car honking outside my window,
Yeah.
then who is the I that is doing the thinking?
That is the million-dollar question. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the sources address the construction of the self to answer exactly that.
Okay.
Our default assumption is that the sense of I is the constant, unchanging author of our experience. You feel that you are the entity generating the thoughts and feeling the anxiety.
Yeah, obviously. But when observed at a granular millisecond level, the text argues that the self is not the author at all. The sense of self is a post hoc narrative layered onto the experience after the fact.
After the fact. Let's break down the actual chronological sequence of how the I gets added after the fact.
Let's use the sensation of anxiety you just mentioned. A physiological shift occurs in the body. Perhaps a slight tightening in the chest, a shallow breath, maybe an increase in heart rate.
Okay, I know that feeling.
That is the raw sensory data. It simply occurs in awareness, much like a sudden noise. There is no you required for the chest to tighten. But a fraction of a second later, the cognitive labeling kicks in. A thought arises that says, I am anxious about my presentation.
Ah, so the physical sensation happens first, and the psychological ownership of the sensation is claimed immediately afterward.
Yes. The sense of a solid, persistent self emerges through memory continuity and narrative gravity. The brain strings together thousands of individual momentary events, the tight chest, the thought about the presentation, the memory of a past failure, and weaves them into a continuous story called my anxiety.
Wow.
The profound implication of the research is that the self is not the director of the movie. The self is just a recurring character in the subtitles.
The concept of narrative gravity is crucial there. Thoughts cling to each other to create the illusion of a solid object, much like individual frames of film moving fast enough create the illusion of continuous motion.
That's a great way to put it.
When you slow it down, you realize there is no permanent I carrying the anxiety. There are just fresh moments of physical tension, followed by fresh thoughts claiming ownership of the tension. It is a highly analytical framework, but the sources insist this is completely testable. This isn't just philosophy, it's an active lab manual.
Absolutely. Because if this framework remains purely intellectual, it serves no real purpose. The observation manual in our SAC provides very specific exercises to test this in daily life. Let's examine exercise 1, which is designed to help the observer locate pre-label perception.
Right. So for you listening right now, the exercise works like this. Look at a mundane object wherever you happen to be. A steering wheel, a coffee cup, a desk. Try to notice the raw visual data, the way the light reflects off the surface, the specific curve of the shape, the texture in the microscopic window of time before your language center activates and names it coffee cup.
It's hard at first.
Yeah, you're trying to observe the data before the augmented reality glasses project the label.
It requires sustained practice because the brain's conceptual categorization is incredibly fast. But once you catch that slight delay, you begin to see the machinery of interpretation working in real time. And exercise 3 from the manual is even more applicable to daily life. It focuses on detecting self-construction during moments of psychological friction.
This is where the rubber meets the road. Let's say you receive a highly critical email from your boss. The exercise asks you to observe the exact sequence of events. First, you read the words on the screen.
Right.
Second, the physiological response hits a rush of adrenaline, heat in the face, a sinking feeling in the stomach. That is the raw physical data. Third, observe how the narrative label arrives to wrap around the physical sensation. My boss hates me, or I am failing, or I am under attack.
And catching that sequence gives you immense cognitive space.
Yeah.
You realize that you are not the failure, and you are not even the physical stress.
Exactly.
The physical stress is merely a transient sensation appearing in your awareness, exactly like the car alarm outside. Your mind is simply rushing to take ownership of it and turn it into a crisis of identity.
When you begin practicing this observation, it completely transforms your relationship with the positive aspects of life as well. The phenomenological essays present a striking redefinition of what a blessing actually is.
I love this part.
In our normal conceptual framework, we think of a blessing as something highly positive being added to our lives. We get a promotion, we go on a fantastic vacation, we find a great parking spot. We require external conditions to align perfectly for a moment to be labeled good.
Yeah, the conventional view is entirely dependent on the physical environment satisfying the demands of the subtitles. But from the perspective of direct observation, the texts redefine a blessing simply as unobstructed experience.
Unobstructed experience, you don't need a sunset or a massive windfall of money to feel complete.
Exactly. When the heavy layers of mental distortion drop away, when the compulsion to constantly judge, label, and manipulate the present moment is paused, ordinary, mundane experience reveals itself to be entirely sufficient.
Just sitting there.
Yeah, just sitting in a chair, feeling the temperature of the room without the director's commentary demanding that the moment be somehow different or more exciting is the blessing. The friction is gone.
But before we move toward our conclusion, we absolutely need to address some common misconceptions. Because it is very easy to hear this analysis and swing to absolute extremes. The authors explicitly outline what this cognitive framework is not.
That is a necessary guardrail, for sure. First, realizing that mental interpretation is a constructed narrative does not mean that nothing is real.
Right, this is not an invitation to nihilism.
Exactly. The raw experience, the physical pain of an injury, the joy of a connection, the sound of music, the color of the sky is absolutely real. It is only the complex historical story we tell ourselves about the sensory data that is constructed.
Second, realizing that attention amplifies our perception of reality does not mean you possess total magical causality over the physical universe.
As we discussed regarding cognitive activation, your attention influences and shapes your subjective experience of reality. It dictates what enters your narrative, but it does not grant you telekinetic control over external physical events.
Right, you can't just move objects with your mind.
No, and furthermore, this clarity of unobstructed perception is not a permanent achievement. It's not a video game level you unlock and stay in forever. Clarity appears, and clarity is obscured by thought. It is a continuous, living practice of noticing the gap, not a finish line to cross.
And lastly, this is an observational framework. It requires zero blind faith. You don't need to adopt a new religion or change your personality. You simply have to pay closer, more granular attention to the mechanics of your own mind.
It is entirely empirical. You test it against your own first-person experience.
So what does this all mean? When we zoom all the way out and look at the entirety of these sources, the research suggests that we fundamentally misunderstand the structure of a human life.
We really do.
We conceptualize life as a discrete, solid object with a clear beginning and end. We carry around a heavy narrative that says, my life started at birth, it is a bounded story about me, and I must protect it. But through direct, sustained observation, you discover that life is actually a continuous, fluid process of sensory unfolding. Yeah, there is no fixed, permanent you standing completely apart from the flow of experience trying to manage it. You are the flow itself.
And the final essay in the stack provides an ultimate synthesis for all this. It's a beautiful one-line compression of the entire cognitive and phenomenological framework we have discussed today.
Let's hear it.
It reads, experience unfolds. Attention selects. Thought interprets. The self is added afterward.
Experience unfolds. Attention selects. Thought interprets. The self is added afterward. That is a brilliant mechanical anchor to keep coming back to whenever you feel overwhelmed.
It perfectly distills the architecture of how we build our world, fraction of a second by fraction of a second. You do not need a new set of beliefs to find clarity. You only need to observe the construction process that is already happening right in front of you.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something that builds on this framework but takes it into a slightly different arena. We have spent this deep dive talking about your own internal augmented reality glasses, but consider what happens when you interact with someone else. Yeah, every person you meet is wearing their own pair of glasses, running their own deeply conditioned subtitles, projecting their own entirely unique interpretations onto the exact same raw sensory data.
Two entirely different movies playing at once.
Exactly. So the next time you find yourself locked in a bitter disagreement or a misunderstanding with a colleague or a partner, ask yourself, are you actually arguing about the raw facts of the situation, or are you just violently clashing over whose subtitles are correct? What would happen if you paused, recognize that both of you are trapped in an interpretation, and try to locate the raw, unobstructed experience beneath the conflict? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep observing the mechanics of your own attention.